Well, good morning, everybody. I will be officially welcoming everyone in a few moments after we hear a few announcements. The first announcement is now is the time to silence cell phones. And I know we have at least a couple more. Here's one handed to me in writing. Springtime potluck, Saturday, April 13, 2024. Beginning at 4 p.m. and going to whenever. That will be at Ken and Becky Tanner's house, 3712 Greenbrier Road. The main dish will be Sloppy Joe's. Please bring a side, chips, beans, salad, or bean salad, I suppose, or dessert to add to the table. Should be fun. Come. And I know Becky herself has one that I think she wanted to read. And I don't know if there are any more back there. Free Thinkers, 1 o'clock today, here? Okay, that's from Roland.
Oh, one after you, Becky. I want to thank each and every one of you for your generosity during our pledge drive. We have raised pledges of $93,240 for next year. Our pledge drive is officially over, but you can still turn in.
Who invited him?
I don't know, and he's even an usher today.
Begging for money.
That was the Baptist in you coming out, yeah. Our pledge drive is officially over, but all pledges will still be gladly accepted. There's a box out there. Just drop it in, and I will see to it. But I thank you very, very much, and the whole church thanks each of us, because we together are the church. Thank you.
Amy Carter sent me this. There is going to be a discussion this Wednesday, April 10th, at 3 p.m. It's up in Tucson with Professor Peter Beinart talking about the war in Gaza, U.S. policy, and Jewish discourse. Professor Beinart teaches national reporting and opinion writing at the Cooney Graduate Center. He's an editor-at-large for Jewish Currents, a CNN political commentator, a fellow at the Foundation for Middle East Peace. He's a nonfiction writer and a Rhodes Scholar. He might be interesting to listen to. That's 3 o'clock up in Tucson. I had hoped to move my office hours to 12 to 2, and I might have to move them earlier. But I'll definitely be in the building by 8 on Wednesday if anyone wants to see me. I've moved my office hours from Tuesday to Wednesday this week. And if you're interested in hearing Professor Beinart speak to me, I'll get you in touch with Amy. And I think that's everybody.
Thank you. I don't know if we have any more. I've run out of the announcements. By the way, Peter Beinart, didn't know the announcement was about him. I remember reading his stuff in the New Republic going back 25 years ago or more. Always very enlightening. So wish I could make that one, but alas, no. And if there are no more announcements, now that we've heard all the news we've got, I'd like to officially welcome everyone to Sky Island Unitarian Universalist Church. Again, welcome to all those personally present here in the sanctuary, and everyone who is joining us virtually, courtesy of Zoom. And if those who are here in the sanctuary would like to do so, if you would turn around, take a look at the camera, maybe even stand up, completely up to you, and let's wave at the Zoom people. Hello, Zoom people. Thank you. Good morning to all. My name's Wallace Hoggatt. I'll be the one talking about the lady with the cigarette, among other things. I'll be telling you more about her. Yeah, they're bad for you, and she knew it, but she kept doing it anyway. It's not the only bad thing she did that she knew was bad for her and kept doing anyway. Anyway, we here are a church of the open mind, the loving heart, and the helping hands. In this congregation, we do not share a common set of beliefs, but we do share a common intention to strengthen the powers of love, justice, and peace within us, between us, and in relationship to the web of all existence that we are simply one part of. Whatever your background, wherever you were born or how long ago, whatever your credit history might be, however long or short a time you spent in school, whoever it is you love and whoever it is who loves you, however strangely your story might have unfolded up to now, you are welcome here. And this being the first Sunday of the month of April, we have our covenant of right relations, and there it is up on the screen. So if you would be so kind as to join in the reading of all of us with the covenant of right relations. We, the congregation of Sky Island Unitarian Universalist Church, covenant to treat all beings with compassion and kindness, listen actively and speak responsibly, seek understanding and be open to change, acknowledge our imperfections and our differences with good humor, devote our energies to creating and maintaining a vibrant, beloved community among ourselves and in the greater world. Now, for our chalice lighting, we have a poem by León Felipe Camino Galicia. León Felipe, as he's usually referred to, was born in Spain in 1884. And he traveled extensively before the Spanish Civil War started in 1936, but he came back to support the Spanish Republic in the Spanish Civil War that started in that year, 1936. The legal government of Spain, the Spanish Republic, was attacked by insurgent forces under the leadership of General Francisco Franco, who ultimately won, as we know. León Felipe fled Spain in the late 1930s when it became clear that the Republic was going to lose. León Felipe eventually settled in Mexico and became a citizen there, and he died there in Mexico in 1968. Now, here's probably his best-known poem, best known among those who don't read the Spanish originals much, but it's frequently given the title of Nadie fue ayer, which is simply the first line of the poem. And I'm going to give it to you. I'll also give you a translation of it. I hope you forgive me. León Felipe wrote this, of course, as a Spaniard born and raised, and it was first published in Spain. The paltry Spanish that I know, I didn't learn from Spaniards. I learned from Colombianos and from others from the Western Hemisphere. So I didn't learn that pronunciation, but in order to honor León Felipe and his own poem, I'm going to try to give it the European Spanish accent. One other thing that I'll point out about the poem, that there is something in it that many of us would want to change about it. León Felipe uses the term cada hombre, which means each man. And I think most of us here would prefer something that is more inclusive in its language, and I'll fix that in the translation, but I will read it the way León Felipe wrote it. Nadie fue ayer. Nadie fue ayer, ni va hoy, ni irá mañana hacia Dios, por este mismo camino que yo voy. Para cada hombre, Guarda un rayo nuevo de luz el sol y un camino virgen Dios. And the translation is by Richard Lipinski and Robert Houston with a minor assist from me. No one went yesterday, nor goes today, nor will go tomorrow unto God by this same road that I take. For each of us, the sun keeps a new ray of light, and God a virgin road.
We're a covenantal community, and as such, we support each other when times are bad and rejoice together when times are good. Here are those joys and sorrows that have been submitted to be read out loud. Does anyone, do we have any? Are there any in the back?
I haven't gotten any.
Okay, well, I have 3 slides. We're going to start, thank you. So this is all from Carolyn Cook, who's been able to get a house. When I have a picture of the house that I like, I will show that. But first slide, we want to see her new mantra is, all you need is love and the beach. And as you can see in the next slide, she sent me this on Valentine's Day. She gets a lot of beach. And on the next slide, she gets some love. She says, Rusty doesn't look happy, but I think he appreciates his rain gear. And you can see, so, to make us feel a little better, it does rain an awful lot where she is in Oregon. We miss her, but we're happy her life is coming together so well in her new spot. But Deborah and I have always wanted to figure out a way we could have kept her here. So joy for Carolyn. She has a new house.
Let me now place all the rest of the stones into the water to symbolize those joys and sorrows which have been left unspoken this morning. Unspoken but not unheard. Well, the holidays just keep on coming this time of year. Last Sunday, of course, was Easter, and today is simultaneously World Health Day and National Beer Day. Any tension between these two things? I mean, you decide. And of course, tomorrow is Total Eclipse of the Sun Day, not because Congress said so, but because that's the way things work. Just in case we needed more dark and less light, we have a total eclipse of the sun. But more to the point of what I'm going to be talking about this morning, today, April 7th, starts the beginning of National Library Week. Yes, okay, let's cheer for libraries, absolutely. But I'm actually not going to talk to you about libraries as a concept or libraries in general, but about a specific library. It was in my neighborhood when I was a child. And many of you know that I grew up in Los Angeles. And when I say Los Angeles, I do mean real LA, not one of the suburbs, but really LA. Bordering on Westlake, close to the Wilshire District, just a relatively short bus ride away from Hollywood. That's where I grew up. And we lived in a number of different places, but generally in that same general locality. And so during most of the time that I was a child growing up in Los Angeles, our neighborhood library was the Felipe de Neve branch of the library, named after the Spanish governor of the Californias who decided that it would be a great thing to establish a city, which eventually became Los Angeles, in Southern California. So that's why he's being honored by the city library. Now, when I went to my library, the Felipe de Neve branch library, when I went there, I walked most of the time. Now, sometimes I skateboarded really. I mean, it's kind of hard to imagine looking at me that I used to skateboard. But we considered that a means of transportation. I never learned tricks the way my brothers did, but I got from point A to point B very frequently on a skateboard. So sometimes I would skateboard there, but the librarians at the Felipe de Neve branch of the library didn't really like skateboards in the library, so I switched to walking most of the time. I'd walk over to Vermont, a major north-south artery, and then I'd go south on Vermont down to 6th Street. At the corner of Vermont and 6th, if I were to take a left turn, I would get to the Felipe de Neve branch library. That's turning east, I'm facing south. And before we get to that, however, before we head that way over to my library, I want to give you an idea of other landmarks in the neighborhood where I grew up, and those things that existed when I grew up there. Just 3 or 4 blocks away from the library was a high-end, high-priced department store called the Bullock's Wilshire. Christopher, that's number 23. There it is. It was such an architectural, artistic, grand edifice that they put it on postcards. And there's a postcard of the Bullock's Wilshire. And if that looks familiar to you, that architectural style looks familiar to you, take a look at image 24. There's the Cochise County Courthouse, the same architectural style, Art Deco. Not the same architect, at least as far as I can tell. Now, the Bullock's Wilshire, which, by the way, that was a place where, you know, a lot of us from the neighborhood could not afford to shop. We didn't shop there, or my family didn't shop there, and very few people that I knew were able to shop there. The Bullock's Wilshire, however, is still standing, but it isn't a store anymore. It's part of the Southwestern Law School. But if you go maybe 2 or 3 extra blocks away from Bullock's, you would get to the First Unitarian Church of Los Angeles. It's image 25, and there it is. That is, as some of you know, that is the only church my mother ever took me to more than once. The only one. It is still standing, it is still there, and unlike the Bullock's Wilshire building, it is still being used for its original purpose. Now, about half a mile away from First Unitarian, if you come back to Wilshire, this is south of Wilshire, but if you come back to Wilshire and then go west, that is to the right, for maybe half a mile, if that, you will get to the old Ambassador Hotel, image 26. Now, the Ambassador is no longer standing, but when it was a going concern, it was really, really something. Now, many of us who lived in the vicinity of the Ambassador couldn't possibly ever have dreamed of staying there or being on the premises except, you know, long enough basically to be shooed away. It was way too opulent, way too expensive for us. The Academy Awards were held there 6 separate times, I think mainly before, or if not exclusively before the TV era, but 6 separate times. Movie stars, presidents, world leaders, they all stayed at the Ambassador. And of course, we know that the Ambassador was also where Bobby Kennedy was shot in 1968. After the shooting, the Ambassador started on a decline from which it never recovered. It closed permanently in 1989. It was finally torn down about 18 years ago. The historical preservation people wanted to save it, but it couldn't be saved. At least that's what some people claimed. Now there is a school complex there, and it's named after Robert Kennedy. I suppose we ought to be thankful for small favors. At least it's not an auto mall or something like that. Let's go back to the Felipe de Neve Branch Library, image 27. There it is, 2820 West 6th Street in Los Angeles, California. Now, that wasn't too fancy for us. It was free, and it also is still standing, and it also is still being used for its original purpose. Now, I liked going to the library by myself. I was undoubtedly too young to go by myself, but I did. I could go there and not be compared to my older brothers, which didn't happen closer to our home because everybody knew us. It didn't happen at school because the teachers and administrators and so forth knew my older brothers because they had come through 2 years earlier, and there I am. So I was always being compared to my two brothers, and I rarely came out well in that comparison, I am here to tell you. But those same dynamics did not apply when I went to the library. As far as the Felipe de Neve library staff were concerned, I was the kid who came in without adult supervision, the one who wanted to read a bunch of stuff not really intended for children. Now, it wasn't as if the librarians at Felipe de Neve were necessarily happy with my choices of reading material. There was one of them in particular who kept trying to steer me over in the direction of kid lit. And I have to tell you, when I was a child, during almost all of my childhood, I always looked younger than I actually was. I looked a couple of years younger than I was. I was small, not that I'm real big now, but I was small, and I was thin. As the old saying goes, I had to stand twice to make one shadow, you know. And so here was this small kid, and I'm sure that the one librarian in particular who kept trying to steer me towards Kid Lit probably looked at me and thought, wow, this is the target audience for Danny and the Dinosaur. Or maybe the Hardy Boys and the Secret of the Old Mill. I know what that kid wants. But fortunately for me, there was another librarian who was there who thought that whatever I wanted to read was fine. I think she at some point must have given a signal to the other librarian because I stopped getting pushed in the direction of the Hardy Boys. So I think the signal must have gone out, hey, the kid gets to read what he wants. So at Felipe de Neve, I read things by a wide range of writers, including people I still read because their stuff is good, including a lot of junk, I know. But I read a wide range of material from a group called the Members of the Algonquin Roundtable. Now, I didn't set out to find them, it's just that I fell into that. And I need to explain what the Algonquin Roundtable was. In the 10 years, 15 years or so after the end of World War I, there was a group of newspaper columnists and writers, magazine writers, especially including writers for the New Yorker, which started in 1925. There were Broadway people, composers, actors, others who would meet for lunch at the Algonquin Hotel in Manhattan, New York. Folks like James Thurber and Robert Benchley and George S. Kaufman and sometimes Harpo Marx and Edna Ferber and others would show up there at the Algonquin Hotel. And they would have lunch and they would smoke too much and they would tell stories about each other and tell stories about people who weren't there to defend themselves, and they would have a regular routine about meeting down there. And the star of the Algonquin Roundtable was Dorothy Parker. There she is up on the screen, Dorothy Parker. Now, Dorothy Parker, I had heard my parents talk about her, but I hadn't read any of her stuff until I found it in my branch library. Dottie Parker isn't remembered all that much anymore, and that's really a major shame. She deserves to be read now and at a lot of other times as well. But in the 1920s and into the 1930s and beyond, she was very, very well known indeed. And if we have image 29, we can see there it is. There is the Algonquin Round Table. Probably they had to bring up a few more chairs depending on who was showing up for lunch on a particular day, but that's from the Algonquin Hotel. That's the round table that eventually they were provided for their lunches. And in the background, a little hard to see, but that is a cartoon of the members of the Algonquin Round Table, at least some of them. Dorothy Parker had been born Dorothy Rothschild. She got the last name Parker from her first husband. Now, that marriage didn't last, but the name did. Until her death in 1967 at the age of 73, she was Mrs. Parker. And she had been born in 1893 into a privileged New York family. But family tragedies caused a loss of wealth. And that served as an incentive for young Dottie Rothschild at the time, to write articles and stories for submission to magazines. And she never, throughout the rest of her life, she never tried to hide the fact that she got into writing because she had to pay the bills. When she was in her 60s, she was interviewed by somebody for a high-tone quarterly review. And this high-tone quarterly review interviewer asked her, "What is the source of your work?" And Dottie Parker answered, "Need of money, dear." And this is the same person. I'll bet she had repeated that line many times before, because years earlier, she had said that the two most beautiful words in the English language, the two most exquisitely beautiful words in the English language, were check and closed. Now, Dottie Parker was well known in her day as a wit. Here's a story often told about her. It concerns Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge, who had been President of the U.S. During several years in the 1920s. Calvin Coolidge was known as Silent Cal for a good reason. He rarely said anything. He rarely did anything. He was kind of inert. In January of 1933, Calvin, when he was out of office, had been for about 4 years, he died. And when word came to Dorothy Parker that Calvin Coolidge had died, she said, "How can they tell?" Now, things that Dottie Parker said were spread around by newspaper columnists. That was their social media mechanism back in the day. Newspaper columnists would show up to the Algonquin Round Table for lunch, and they would sit there and listen, and really all they had to do was keep alert for whatever Dorothy Parker said, and then their columns would pretty much write themselves. Now, Dottie herself had a column of her own. In the late 1920s and into the 1930s, she had a regular book review column in the New Yorker called The Constant Reader. That's the way it was printed. In the New Yorker, it didn't give her name, but she was the one who wrote everything that went into The Constant Reader. And in 1928, she published a review in that column, which is probably, I would say, the most famous review ever done in America, certainly one of them. She reviewed The House at Pooh Corner, featuring Winnie the Pooh. And Constant Reader detested this syrupy, cloying language, especially Winnie's use of the word hummy. Now, don't ask what that means. It really doesn't matter. It is just one of those words that Winnie the Pooh liked to use. Dottie Parker concluded her constant review of this book as follows: "And it is that word hummy, my darlings, that marks the first place in The House at Pooh Corner at which Tonstant Ouida flowed up." Now, Dottie Parker was the wittiest writer in America at the time, and she really wasn't even trying. She did not classify herself as a humorist, but rather as a serious writer. And she was a serious writer. Her most famous short story, she never wrote a novel, but her most famous short story, which won her the O. Henry Prize, a big prize for short stories, is called Big Blonde. Big Blonde. And it wasn't funny. It wasn't supposed to be funny. It was about an alcoholic. And Dorothy Parker went to Hollywood, as many writers did, and she went too, lured by Hollywood money, to write for the movies. And in 1937, and then again in 1947, she was nominated for Academy Awards. In 1937 for the script, the movie script, of the original version of A Star is Born, and in 1947 for another movie called Smash Up the Story of a Woman, kind of forgettable now, but that was for the original story. What's interesting is that both of those movies that were made, both of the bodies of work that Dottie Parker created to help create those movies, they were about alcoholics. If you remember, A Star is Born, Norman Maine is an alcoholic, and Smash Up the Story of a Woman, well, the woman is an alcoholic. Dottie herself was an alcoholic, and she knew what she was writing about. And Dorothy Parker also suffered from depression throughout her adult life, by the way, one of many points of similarity between Dottie Parker and my mother. Dottie Parker attempted suicide 3 times. And many of her stories and poems nowadays would merit content warnings. They really would. The following story describes heavy drinking and thoughts of self-harm. If you or someone you know is in crisis, help is available. Call the number on your screen. Here's her most famous poem. You may have heard it. You probably wouldn't associate it with the title, because the title sounds a little odd, at least at first. The title is Resume, but it's from 1926. Razors pain you, rivers are damp, acids stain you, and drugs cause cramp. Guns aren't lawful, nooses give, gas smells awful, you might as well live. Now, I've been talking a lot about Dorothy Parker today, but honestly, I didn't originally plan to talk about Dorothy Parker in a church sermon. And honestly, the whole idea of a church sermon about Dorothy Parker is borderline ridiculous. After all, she got out of Catholic school. I mean, her secular Jewish father sent his daughter to Catholic school for an education. And after she got out of Catholic school, she rarely went in for church of any kind or sermons of any flavor. And she used to say that she was chased out of Catholic school because she described Immaculate Conception as, her words, spontaneous combustion. Now, if you were to leave here today and go find some other kind of churchy people and tell them that the sermon today was about Dorothy Parker, they would mightily disapprove, assuming they knew anything about Dorothy Parker. Now, my original plan in talking this morning was going to be to talk about the Spanish Civil War, and actually I still plan to follow through on that. But there's a reason that I'm talking about Dorothy Parker. Last Monday, April 1st, marked the 85th anniversary of the end of the Spanish Civil War. And the history of that war really should be better known today. I decided to profile Dottie Parker because of what she wrote on the topic of that war. And she wrote it in an article first published near the end of the Spanish Civil War in a now largely forgotten magazine. I couldn't simply quote her words without telling you something about her. I'm not the first person to point out that the times in which we now find ourselves are creepily similar to the 1930s. Today, just as in the 1930s, we see great interest in what back then was called fascism and what we call today authoritarianism, but you know what? It's all the same political DNA. It's really the same stuff. And in the 1930s in America and a lot of other places throughout the world, there were those, and that includes a lot of rich and powerful and well-heeled people who thought that their countries, including those in America, they thought that about America, they thought America would be so much better off if we just followed the example of European dictators. That's what we had in the 1930s, and today we have, well, you know what we have. Dottie Parker was a leftist. Contrary to some accusations that were made at the time and continued thereafter, there isn't any good evidence she was a communist, but she was leftist enough to be blacklisted in Hollywood in the 1950s. You know, the real crime that she committed, the real thing that made her blacklisted in Hollywood, well, she was an anti-fascist way too early, before other people. And she showed that in her support for the Spanish Republic during the Spanish Civil War. The Spanish Civil War lasted from 1936 to 1939. And the way it started was in 36, there were some elements of the Spanish military led by Francisco Franco who started a revolt against the legally elected, legally holding office government of Spain, which was called then, and we still refer to it as the Spanish Republic. And so the people who were in support of the Spanish Republic are often referred to as the Republicans or the Spanish Republicans. The opponents of the Republic, often, especially nowadays, referred to as the nationalists. Some people called them that. Some people back then, especially within their own groups, they often referred to themselves as el movimiento, the movement. But we'll use the term nationalist because that's what we are most familiar with. The nationalists got a lot of help during the Spanish Civil War from Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. The Republic tried to get help from its fellow democracies, places like Britain and France and the United States, but that help was not forthcoming, so they accepted support where they could get it, namely from the Soviet Union. And with supporters like that, who needs opponents, honestly? The Nazis and the fascists treated the Civil War as a trial run for what ultimately became the Second World War. But the Soviet Union, they treated the Spanish Civil War as an exercise in ideological cleansing, regardless of the outcome on the battlefield. After 3 years of fighting, the nationalists defeated the Republic. Thousands were killed during the war itself, and later, after the war ended, there were executions and imprisonments of people whose crime consisted of having supported the legal government of their country while it was the legal government. And the war came to an end not with a treaty between the combatants or with the surrender of one side. Those two ways are usually the way wars end. I mean, two sides come together, hey, let's stop this fighting, and here's what's going to happen. Or in these days of unconditional surrender, somebody unconditionally surrenders. That's what Nazi Germany did. That's what Imperial Japan did in 1945. But that isn't the way the war ended in Spain in 1939. What happened was Franco declared victory. He just said, I won. I'm in charge. And it worked. It worked. Last Monday was the 85th anniversary of that declaration by Franco that his side had won. It was a brutal war, a very brutal war. We're accustomed to talking about brutal wars, but a lot of what we know about brutal wars comes from wars beginning with and continuing after the Spanish Civil War. La Guerra Civil was a war in which, to an unprecedented degree, civilians were targeted. The Spanish Civil War taught future war criminals how to massacre civilians effectively. We have image 30. Do we have image 30? Pablo Picasso's painting, Guernica. That is a representation of mass murder by air. Basque village, peaceful village, not part of the fighting, bombed, many people killed, bombed by the nationalists. Now the Republicans, the Spanish Republicans, were not innocent of atrocities during the war. But you know, the nationalists and their accomplices were just so much better at committing atrocities than the Republicans. The nationalists really seemed to like that kind of work. Dottie Parker wrote an account of her efforts to support the Spanish Republic. It was published in The New Masses, which was a Marxist magazine, although Parker's article wasn't recognizably Marxist. You can read that over and over and not find any Marxist dogma or turgid Marxist language which was commonly used. It appeared, her article, in the March 14, 1939 issue. That was just 3 weeks before Franco's declaration of victory. And she knew what the outcome was going to be. Everybody at that point knew what the outcome was going to be. By the way, as far as I can tell, that article from the New Masses in March of 1939 is now in the public domain. I might be wrong, but it was originally copyrighted in 1939 by the New Masses, the Marxist magazine. They copyrighted it, but the copyright wasn't reviewed again in the 1960s when it had to be under the law in effect at the time. So here we have a Marxist magazine that fails to take steps to preserve its intellectual capital. Now, somewhere in there, there's an irony just waiting to announce itself. Now, the normal practice around here is that when we have a reading, the reading goes before the sermon. But that's not what I'm doing today. Today, the reading will come now at the end, or almost at the end, of the sermon. It's from Not Enough by Dorothy Parker, March 14, 1939. And I'll skip roughly the first half, not that it isn't good, it's great stuff, but time constraints lead me to make that choice. But she talks about her background. She talks also about how earlier in the Spanish Civil War she had gone to Spain to see what was going on. And she didn't go because she really wanted to. And she was very honest about why she didn't want to, unlike a lot of people who would cover up their failure to go with high sound, well, I don't want to go there and, eat their food when they need all the food and things like that. Dottie Parker was very honest about why she didn't want to go. She didn't want to see children who'd been blown up. She didn't want to be blown up herself. And she said that very honestly, but she basically got shamed into going by a friend of hers, so she went. We'll pick it up again. We'll pick it up in the article when she comes back to the U.S. She says, well, anyway, when I came back from Spain, I tried to do what I could. I spoke a great deal about the people and the things I had seen. It is difficult for me to speak before an audience, and sometimes I think that if I have to hear my voice uttering the syllables of fascism once again, I shall vomit. The only extenuation I can offer is that I mean what I say and that it raises money. But the thing is, I speak only to audiences who think as I do, for no others want my services. The thing is that when I write a piece about loyalist Spain, magazines won't take it. I feel that it is my duty and my function as a writer to get my pieces into papers the readers of which do not yet know. And if one of them or two of them are made to think, then I have done my work. But my work is dismissed, and on the strength of what seems to me a curious adjective, unpleasant. The last editor, who may as well be nameless because he has all the other qualities of a bastard, told me that if I changed my piece to make it in favor of Franco, he would publish it. God damn it, he said, why can't you be funny again? Well, you see, I don't feel funny anymore. I don't think these are funny times, and I don't think Franco is funny. I don't think I can fight fascism by being comical, nor do I think that anybody else can. I don't know what to say to the letters and voices that ask me when I write or speak about my milk fund for Spanish children, and what are you doing for the children of America? How can you say, don't you see, it's all part of the same thing? How can you answer dopes? You ask me how I combat fascism, and I hang my head to say I do wrong things. I know many silly people because I've known them for years, and I cannot keep my face shut when they talk peculiar idiocy, when they say everybody should keep very quiet and do nothing about anything, or when they shake their heads and sigh that unions are all rackets, or when they murmur, oh, well, I'm content to stay in my own ivory tower. Oh, God, that dreary ivory tower, the only window of which looks out on the fascist side. I talk loud and presently scream and eventually make personal remarks about their faces or the shapes of their legs or the cut of their clothes. In all of which comments, as God hears me, I'm perfectly justified, but it is no time for that kind of truths. It is best, I know, to stay away from such people. There will be no convincing them until they see what has happened. So, what I do about combating fascism is to see my own people and feel fine that we are together and we are more than any in the world and that our time will come. That is my strength in my life. But when I'm not with them, I think that I have no waking moment through the day or in the night when I am not guilty, when I am not saying to myself as I turn from a newspaper story I cannot bear to read, or hear a man with 6 children telling how he may work 2 days a week in a mill for $4, when I do not say to myself, you're doing almost as much as you can, baby. That's fine, but that's not enough. Now, a postscript to the reading, a postscript to the sermon. In Dottie Parker's 1930s, fascism was everywhere on the march, both at home and abroad, especially in Spain, but not limited to Spain. Today, authoritarianism, if you want to use that term, or better yet, let's just call it the anti-democratic movement. It's all over the place. It's on the march at home and abroad. You know, we don't want, or we shouldn't want, to find that on some day in the not-too-distant future, some anti-democratic leader or movement declares victory over the American way of life with a piece of paper. Whatever it is we're doing now to prevent that eventuality from happening, whatever it is we're doing, in Dottie Parker's words, it's not enough. For our closing words, and there is Leon Felipe, and the poem is called Colophon in English. And I have to tell you, I'm not sure where I got the translation. I'd like to give credit, but I can't. But here it is in the original and then in translation. Luz, cuando mis lágrimas te alcancen, la función de mis ojos ya no será llorar, sino ver. Light. When my tears reach you, the function of my eyes will no longer be to cry, but to see. We can extinguish the chalice, go in peace after the postlude.